All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Maria. I'm the CEO of Tech Nation. I'm going to be your moderator for today. So our session today is about how to scale a startup across Southeast Asia. It's no secret that Southeast Asia is quickly moving onto the global stage when it comes to tech, startups, and of course, the funding that accompanies such growth. Yet regional expansion remains difficult because of the fragmented nature of Southeast Asia, and startups with their limited resources and time need to navigate this challenge. So that's what our stacked panel today will be discussing, and we're going to help cover this issue from a startup, investor, and government perspective. To quickly recap, we'll be covering recent startup trends and opportunities within the region, best practices from successful startups such as Shopback, how one can secure funding, talent, build partnerships, and expand across the region, and in particular, partner with Singapore in their growth efforts. So let me bring up our panelists now. Let me first welcome Nick Nash, co-founder and managing partner in Asia Partners. Next, we have Dixon Yu, regional director for Indonesia at EDB. And finally, we have Candice Ong, chief commercial officer at Shopback, and my fellow alumnus. Hi, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, afternoon, everyone.
Nice to see you, Maria.
Nice to see you too.
Happy to be here.
Great. All right. So just to let everybody at home know, we will be kind of talking through the major points I just outlined for the first 45, 50 minutes or so, but we do have a Q&A session at the end. So attendees, drop your questions in the chat box and we will get to them, as many of them as we can by the end of the session. Let's first talk about the current Southeast Asia landscape and what we're really seeing from a tech and startup perspective. So Nick, maybe if you can start us off, how has the tech industry in this region evolved in the last 3 years? And what are you anticipating for the next 3 to 5 years?
It's a great question, Maria. And you think about, what's really been going on in Southeast Asia. There are two broad patterns that we see. The first is that Southeast Asia is mirroring much of the developments and advances that took place in China over the last roughly 10 or 15 years. We think of this as a golden age concept. And what I mean by that very concretely is if you look back in time and you think about when China had roughly the same level of affluence that Southeast Asia has right now, it was between 2003 and 2014. And when you look back in time and you think, when did Korea have roughly the same level of affluence that we have right now? It was roughly 75, 76 to 85. But here's the startling fact. The companies that went public in Korea, 75 to 86, give or take. The companies that went public in China, 03 to 13, give or take. In both regions, those companies are more than half of today's market cap, that one precious decade. And we're seeing the exact same thing happening again in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia's first mega cap public company, my old friends at Sea, is now $185 to $190 billion public company. And it won't be the last public company, which is part of why I retired, to go find the next ones and support them. But this concept of a golden age is really important. And it's linked to another very interesting concept, which is the IPOs of companies, which in some ways is a outcome, not a cause of success. They tend to be roughly 5 to 10 years time spaced in Southeast Asia versus China. Consider the fact that Sea's IPO in 2017 was the first e-commerce IPO from Southeast Asia. Guess what? The first e-commerce IPO from China was in 2007. And one by one, we see these sort of like roughly 5 to 10 year parallels. So the wonderful fact is that Southeast Asia is in fact the most interesting part of Asia today in terms of its affluence. And we have a little bit of a river guide as to what might happen next in terms of following some of the patterns of the past.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. That sets us up pretty well, I think, for the rest of the discussion. Dixon, you sit in a pretty interesting spot as the Indonesia director for EDB. And obviously, Indonesia's tech scene is a lot of what the global attention is being focused on. This year alone, we've seen some really interesting IPOs as well as M&As from the local tech scene there. What are some of the key factors that are driving such growth within that region and country?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. I think if you look at the Indonesia tech sector, it really is a booming sector, right? Just last year, the digital economy in Indonesia really grew by 11% to $44 billion, right? And there are various factors driving the industry there. If you look at Indonesia's market, you think about a huge market in Southeast Asia, 270 million people, right? A young population and a rising middle class. So these are well-known facts, but essentially it creates a market, right? They can drive digital adoption and take up digital solutions as well. But taking a closer look at the structure of Indonesia's economy and society, you start to see various areas that are ripe for disruption in the digital economy, right? Whether that is your long tail of micro, small, and medium enterprises that actually make up 99% of businesses and 60% of GDP, right? Whether that is, a sprawling economy over 17,000 islands, right, which provides opportunity for connectivity and logistics, right? Or even, or whether it's the over 60% underbanked or unbanked population. And these provide a lot of opportunities for digital disruptions, right? And I think in the early days of Indonesia, right, local startups have really dominated and saw that opportunity ripe for the growth of digital economy and have stepped in, right? It is why then, it's not easy to say that a foreign startup can just, dominate quickly in the Indonesian market, because it's one that requires high context, right? So if you think about the early startups in Indonesia, like Gojek, Tokopedia, Traveloka, these have really gained momentum and obtained a foothold in Indonesia, right? The next generation of startups will then look at the example of these larger, more mature startups, right? And come in more waves, right? And it creates a new next generation of startups, new opportunities. And finally, I think the key area to note is also, with so many companies, so many opportunities, Indonesia is then ripe also for the inflow of capital and investments, which has really driven the digital economy there, right? If you think about 2020 and the $8 billion that was invested into startups in the digital economy in Indonesia, or rather in Southeast Asia, 70% actually went to Indonesia. Investors are not just regional and local, but increasingly international, right? Your Western tech giants, your Chinese tech giants are all going into Indonesia. And together, a collection of these factors then drive the digital economy and the startup ecosystem in Indonesia.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And in terms of the global investment, I think to Nick's earlier point, C Group, I think, created a lot of global FOMO in terms of those investors who felt like they missed out on that initial IPO and the stock offering. Candice, let me bring you in as our startup representative on this panel here. Obviously, Shopback, it's a B2C business, and you have quite a number of offices across the region. So how did y'all evaluate the decision to go regional and keeping Singapore as a headquarters versus going deep in a few particular countries?
Thanks for the question, Maria. So Shopback is a business. We seek to enable users to make better purchasing decisions across the variety of lifestyle needs. And we're one of the largest discovery and rewards platforms. We provide users with information or cashback in terms of their savings. We also serve businesses, and we help the ecosystem grow by partnering merchants to drive adoption of those platforms. So we're a marketing solution as well. I think what's exciting about the region is that there are many similarities in the problems to be solved and consumer behaviors. For example, for users, I think accessibility to well-priced goods and being able to sell digitally is a need for many users as well as sellers. I think in terms of the context of safety in travel, I think that really propelled Grab's business. And also in terms of the behavior on being mobile first, in terms of being very aware or present on social media. Those are very similar behaviors across the region, which enables really, I would say, context for scale and growth, right? It makes sense to launch in these markets because of similarities in users' needs as well as consumer behavior. Now, in terms of for businesses as well, in terms of reaching users cost effectively, and also tackling problems like the lack of credit card penetration, I think those are problems that businesses are also trying to solve. Now, Southeast Asia is also not homogeneous, right? I wouldn't say that necessarily Singapore would be very comparable to likes of, say, Indonesia or Philippines. So I think with respect to having Singapore as HQ, similarities with Singapore has really enabled us to scale well into markets like Australia, even Korea and Taiwan. Whereas in terms of proximity to the region, really enable us to reach customers in broader Southeast Asia, like Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia as well. And I think what has been really interesting in this part of the world is that, as Nick has mentioned, the success of sizable regional players such as Shopee, such as Lazada, such as Grab, has really synergized and driven investment, I would say, excitement for the region and enabled funding and thereby growth in the ecosystem as well. So super excited for the region. I think Singapore being the nexus of where a lot of HQs are related or headquartered as well has been instrumental to the growth for Shopback.
Yeah, absolutely. Candice, let me ask you a follow-up on that one. So we've talked a bit about like the momentum and the trend. So as a company, how do y'all think about capturing that momentum, right? Because you know that funding's coming in and you know that the consumer side is coming up. So what are y'all doing internally to make sure that you're staying on top of this wave and you're kind of maximizing it for all it's worth?
Sure. That's a great question. I think being close to the customer, and the customer on this front, I would say there are two types. One would be the consumer on the ground, as well as businesses and the problems they're trying to solve would be key. So for example, in terms of staying close to the businesses we serve, I think Grab has gone through many waves of innovation. They went from transport to tackling Uber to food delivery and in a way onto the payment space as well. And trying to solve or rather co-solve with them in terms of partners in the ecosystem has been instrumental for us in terms of being able to be relevant to them. Similarly, understanding on the ground what our consumer demands are, I think it's also key. So for example, we definitely see a big wave in terms of direct to consumer for many sellers and brands, right? How do we partner maybe players like Shopify or Shopee or Lazada to drive sellers to establish their brands across the region is also a key focus for us, right? So I think in terms of being customer focused, this will be in terms of merchants we serve or business partners we serve, as well as consumer demand on the ground. Having a close pulse of that, I think in terms of trying to drive demand in the region is crucial.
Okay, yeah, staying close to your customer is always good business advice, of course. Nick, you're kind of our regional resident thinker philosopher. So you talk a lot about development models and paths. In particular, let's compare Southeast Asia's tech and startup scene and their development into that of Silicon Valley, China, and India before us. In what ways do you think that this region is doing things differently and for the betterment of our overall development path?
It's a wonderful question, Marie, and I feel partly to blame. For the last 4 or 5 years, I've been talking a lot about how we have so many similarities to China. And that's partially useful to talk about because human beings think in analogies. And if it worked here, it might work there. Think about the parallels between Garena and the Tencent game business, or Shopee and the Taobao Tmall business, and so many others as well. But I think what's really important to emphasize is that Southeast Asia is big enough and frankly talented, well talented enough to chart its own destiny. And I'm not just saying that in kind of a rah-rah, go Southeast Asia kind of way. I'm saying that in a very practical way. Let me give you 2 concrete examples. Number one, the fact that Singapore is embedded in Southeast Asia confers a great benefit on the broader region because Singapore is turning into Asia's commercial capital. People ask, what's the capital of Latin America? It's probably Miami. What's the capital of Europe? It's probably London. Middle East, Dubai. Singapore is probably the closest thing Asia has to a commercial capital. And I'll show it to you with data. If you just went through LinkedIn and sort of plumbed the depths of that massive database of 600 million human beings, and you look for everybody whose job title had Asia, Asia Pacific, or APAC, APAC in their job title. Maria Lee, CEO, Microsoft Asia, something like that. 25% of all the human beings on the planet that have that particular set of keywords live and work in Singapore. So that's an enormously interesting fact. No other part of Asia has that, no part of the world has that. And that suggests something very interesting. It suggests that Singapore is not just going to be a place where many global companies have corporate headquarters. Singapore is going to create several multi-billion-dollar enterprise software companies. Because you ever notice a funny fact? The founder of a software company is usually a computer scientist, and her successor in the business is usually really good at playing golf. Software is a business that's about selling, enterprise selling. And when 25% of your global customers that are APAC focused sit in Singapore, you betcha there's going to be a software industry here in a way that is larger, I think, than what China will build and what India will build from an export perspective. And the other aspect that's very interesting, Singapore and Southeast Asia more broadly is going to build a preeminent cross-border ecosystem. India's, golly, it's large enough by itself. China is large enough by itself. Each, of course, will import and export raw materials and the like. But Southeast Asia is building one heck of a regional trading ecosystem at the e-commerce level. We see it in companies like SCI e-commerce, which are just booming because of cross-border. So those two nuances add a unique flavor to Southeast Asia's journey.
Great. Happy to hear that. So let's talk quickly about some of the challenges and how startups can actually compete in this region, because as we've mentioned, it is difficult, it's fragmented, and there's a lot of local context that one would need in order to succeed here. So Dixon, let me go to you. What in particular are some of the unique aspects of working in Indonesia that makes operating in the country different? And what are some of the common challenges that you see startups running into when they decide that they're going to expand into Indonesia?
Thanks, Maria, for the question. I think Indonesia, and or rather overall Southeast Asia, is extremely interesting, right? I think what you see in Southeast Asia is very different from other large regions. When you think about the Southeast Asian market, each country is different in terms of politics, culture, language, right? And then you add on the layer of digital disruption, the development of digital infrastructure, and it varies across each country in Southeast Asia. So there are commonalities, but there are big differences as well. In Indonesia, I think, for a country like Indonesia, it's all about finding the right balance, right? There are always two sides of a coin in Indonesia. So the first area I think to think about is looking at size alone is not enough, right? Yes, there is a huge 270 plus million population in Indonesia, but it's useful to think about the geographical complexity, right? Over 17,000 islands in Indonesia, and trying to reach people, right, beyond the tier 1 cities into the tier 2 and tier 3 cities will continue to be a problem statement for many startups looking to scale into the entire country. So that's one, right? Size against geographical complexity. The next thing to think about is then offline versus online, right? In many ways, most industry or most businesses in Indonesia have been used to running in the offline world. You think about your corporations, your family businesses, all the way down to your war rooms, right? It's always been very offline, or traditionally been very offline. When you want to balance that offline against online, right, you have to think about how, right, digital penetration would increase in Indonesia. And now it stands at about 70% of the population. You then have to also think about how, as digital penetration in Indonesia increases, right, how people will go online, right? It would be mobile first, right? Heavily dependent on social media. So say you have opportunities in social commerce and so on. And finally, what's important to note when trying to scale up a startup in Indonesia as well is looking beyond product, right? So you may have an extremely good product, right? You may have the right customer segment, right? But how do you make sure in Indonesia that the rest of the ecosystem, right, continues to grow with you? And that would take an ecosystem bigger than the startup itself, right? It's about partnerships with other startups and larger companies. And also building solutions together with regulators. And so this balance is extremely important and key to scaling up in Indonesia.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think people talk about Southeast Asia not being homogenous, but actually very much the same thing is true for Indonesia. So if you treat Indonesia as one country, I think most startups get shock when they realize, I think, some of the reality of operating on the ground. Candice, for you and Shopback, I'd love to hear a little bit more of the history of your expansion outside of Singapore, which countries you tackled first, and then how you started to build up the playbook, and then which parts of the playbook you found that you actually had to localize each time you expanded to another new country.
Sure. So Shopback was founded in 2014, primarily in Singapore first, but the ambitions to go Southeast Asia and APAC came quite soon after. So Shopback started in Singapore, quickly expanded to Malaysia, Philippines, and rest of Southeast Asia. And after that, Taiwan first, and Australia and South Korea very recently. Now, in terms of teams expansion, I think what we tend to do is to send a SWAT team or expansion team really on the ground to understand the customers locally, both on the consumer front as well as on the business environment, and also seek to hire, I would say, talent that will be suitable and scale in the business, right? What we would look out for would be, of course, business acumen, the ability to work across cultures, the ability to communicate and scale well with HQ. I think those are definitely areas that we pay a lot of attention to. But that being said, I think making sure that we have that continuous communication, alignment with headquarters or with the relevant teams is super key. Right? Not all key teams necessarily sit in Singapore. So for example, some of our tech teams do sit in Singapore, but we've got tech hubs outside in Taipei as well as Vietnam. Similarly, for our operations team, we've got one team in Singapore, but we also have teams sitting across the region as well. I think in terms of distributed work, especially with COVID recently, I think the ability to communicate frequently in person where possible, but frequently through digital means is also especially crucial. So I think with respect to expansion, I would say focus on the people, focus on cultural, I would say in terms of company culture transference, and focus on alignment will be key success factors to enable scale.
Right, fair enough. Nick, you worked previously across the region, now you invest across the region. Would be curious to, if we zoomed out, like some of the macro challenges that you're seeing, is it, I'm just gonna give you a laundry list and you can pick. Talent, we commonly hear as an issue. We hear about various funding gaps at different levels and series. We hear about like stiff competition and then like the ability of a regional company versus and the well-entrenched local competitor. So what are you seeing, I think, from your investor point of view?
Well, it's so important to talk about challenges. And my old business partner, Forrest, would always say, the more I understand about someone or something's weaknesses, the more responsibility I can give them, because I sort of really know where I can overcome things and where they can grow. So let's be very open and very candid about some of the challenges. As folks on this call have mentioned very thoughtfully, talent is an issue. I love to compare and contrast India and Southeast Asia and China. China had enormous market potential and rising affluence and enormous talent. Southeast Asia has enormous market potential now, not so much 10 years ago, and talent is catching up. India has lots of talent, but their market potential will probably get there in 10 years. So which of those three do you want? You probably want the China situation. There was only one of those out there. Which of those next two do you want? I would personally pick the Southeast Asian one, because talent will find a way and talent will grow. It's hard to just imagine market potential, which will only take time. So that's the first issue. The second issue is not just managerial talent, but programming talent. Here we've got some good news. The number of programmers is rising. In fact, Singaporean companies like Glints and others are playing a great role in coordinating talent. We kind of call it BPO 2.0, meaning it's not business process outsourcing like of 20 years ago, but you're creating a distributed workforce with project management, often here in Singapore, to coordinate work, but done indigenously and authentically out in the field. Finally, I'd really point to one final area of complexity and challenge, which is that our region has fits and starts in terms of capital availability. Thanks to the great work of EDB and the Singapore government and other important parties and stakeholders, the upstream ecosystem is developing quite nicely. There's plenty of global capital for companies that want to go public, whether it be in Singapore or elsewhere. The real challenge is probably somewhere in the middle. And I determined that I wanted to do something to fix that. So when I retired from C, I took my equity in the business and I've been redeploying it into that middle stage to help startups. But I think there's still more room to grow there for that middle mile on the highway to get fully capitalized for our companies over here.
All right, so startups are faced with obviously many challenges, but one of them would be probably getting a share of this new funding that's coming in. And another one I think would be differentiating themselves so that they can track the best talent within the region and continue to grow themselves internally. So this one's actually for all the panelists, but in your experience, how do you think startups can differentiate themselves in a growing market like Southeast Asia? Is there a need to do so? Or do you think that over time, the rising tide will lift all boats and they'll end up getting a share of the funding and they'll end up picking up some talent as they go? Stix, I'm starting with you because you're laughing.
Now, I wanted to say Candice should start first because she's the operator here. She runs the startup, but okay, I can share my inputs and maybe let the rest add on. So from what we see, and of course EDB is a government agency, we're no startup or operator. But in the region, if startups would like to differentiate themselves, right, the focus on customer is extremely important, right? Knowing who exactly you're serving and knowing them inside out. So what that means essentially is that to know your customer, you have to collect data about them. You have to analyze the data, right? So in the payment space, you have to understand customer spending patterns. Lending space, you have to create predictive models, right, for credit scoring. Grocery deliveries, you have to know the basket size, the variety, right, the frequency of purchase. And in travel, for example, right, the travel industry was recently hit by the pandemic, right? How do you shift from a model, right, looking at travel, right, and what kind of inventory would your customers want, right? Would it still be, say, co-living spaces, hostels, right, or more private hotels, B&B style accommodations when looking at domestic travel due to the pandemic? So these are some things, right, where companies learn more of. They learn to make use more of, right, customer data. You start to realize that then the back-end understanding of customers would become a deep differentiating capability across various startups. As you see the sort of digital economy then growing, you'll also likely see some divergence, right? Not every startup will attempt to target the mass market, right? But as, like you said, right, like as the rising tide comes, there will be more opportunities, more white spaces for certain startups to enter as well, right? To find their niche in the space, right? And finally, as the digital economy grows as a whole, I think it's important for startups to look at a path to profitability, right? Looking at how you then scale your business in a profitable way and optimize customer lifetime value, right, against customer acquisition costs. And I think more increasingly as startups come under scrutiny and as more funding pours into the startup world, this path to profitability would be extremely important.
Candice, over to you.
Well, just to chime on what Dixon has shared as well, and maybe add a different perspective. I do think that the rising tide will lift all boats in the short term, right? And with that, over time, we'll see which ones emerge as, I would say, leaders in the ecosystem. And over time, I do think that the lead might extend, especially for the dominant players. However, that being said, I do think that there has been tremendous growth, tremendous demand that really enables not just a single player to dominate the ecosystem. I think contrasting that with, say, China, right? You've got Taobao, which is a lot bigger than some of the other players. Whereas in Southeast Asia, you've got multiple leads in different categories. So for example, for food category, you've got Food Panda, you've got Deliveroo, you've got GoFood and GrabFood, and really a collection of different leaders. And sometimes it just depends on the, I would say, leadership in the country. Now, in terms of differentiation then, I think for startups, it's key to understand or key to figure out what would be their focus. Is it geography? Is it offering? Is it a target consumer? And with that, that could inform startups, especially what type of talent to hire for, right? To in terms zoom in terms of those areas that they want to differentiate themselves and be especially particular for those types of talent to enable the build out of their startup. But I think I'm really optimistic for Southeast Asia. I do think the tide is definitely rising.
Great. So let's get to the last part of the content I want to discuss with y'all, which is obviously using Singapore as a partner and a home base, I think, for a lot of startups as they scale. So we know, and Nick already highlighted, but many tech companies, I'll talk about the startup side, Shopee, Grab, but then you have your multinationals like Salesforce and Amazon. They have headquarters or major operations here in Singapore. They have a really strong presence across Southeast Asia. Their leadership is all mostly here. And Singapore in many ways has been called Asia's Silicon Valley. What do you think makes Singapore such an attractive and viable tech hub for companies as they're coming into this region, whether you were talking about Southeast Asia or APAC more generally speaking? Nick?
I'm going to maybe suggest something that's a little bit maybe old school, but I think it's very fundamental. There's a lot of discussion around the world about how government can prime the pump and facilitate entrepreneurship, whether it be education, whether it be tax incentives, streamlining inflow of capital and whatnot. But I'm going to go back to something very fundamental that I hope that would appreciate our sharing today. What makes Singapore such a great hub for tech companies is its fairness, a completely impartial, accurate, and thoughtful judiciary creates the foundation for a place where business can be conducted in an incredibly important way and in a very predictable way. It's not to suggest that other countries aren't great places. They certainly are. But in a certain way, just like Delaware has become the jurisdiction of choice in North America, and England has become the jurisdiction, of course, London particularly, Singapore has become a very predictable and stable jurisdiction to handle disputes, intellectual property. The rules of the tennis match are very clear. Now people can come and practice their game and join the competition. So I would say that beyond all the things that we often talk about, let's not lose sight of the incredible bedrock, which is very, very special and very, very value creating for the entire region.
I think that's super interesting. So basically what you're talking about is like the rule of law and then the standards and the business operating standards that that companies would need in order to abide by to set up and manage their business out of Singapore.
That's exactly right. If you ask me what makes a great World Cup, I wouldn't actually tell you it's the kind of grass on the pitch or it's how well inflated the balls are. I think it's important to have great umpires and referees. And then let Messi and Maradona come and play. And Singapore's done a really good job of that.
Nice. Dixon, anything to add to this?
Yeah, but I think Nick is absolutely right. Right, you build the platform and the fundamentals for people to come in, and they'll do just that. Right? Just to roll off some statistics, right? I think Singapore is home, right, to about in 46% of companies, multinational companies, regional headquarters in Asia, right? And 3,500 startups. And if you look at tech specifically, Singapore hosts 80 of the top 100 tech companies, right? And also out of the 42 unicorns in Southeast Asia, Singapore has slightly more than half, right? So Nick is definitely right to say that you get the fundamentals sorted and I think people will come. But just to add an additional layer beyond that, right? I think startups, or rather the companies, don't just exist alone. There is an ecosystem around them, right, of capital, right, of government schemes and also programs to build ecosystems that continue to drive startups, or rather, they continue to welcome startups into Singapore, right? So, for example, if you look at, say, capital, in the first 9 months of 2021, right, you could see that capital was heavily flowing into Singapore, and a total of 11.2 billion Singapore dollars have been invested into startups in Singapore, right? And that's already double the same period last year. And then you look at talent, right? I think Singapore's livability, stability continues to attract top global talent. And also there are various programs that continue to develop the pipeline of local talent in Singapore as well. And finally, there are various programs that drive networks and collaborations. It starts from very sort of simple, fundamental kinds, like say industry events, right? Like the recently concluded FinTech Festival or Week of Innovation and Technology, to say trade associations like Startup SG. And finally, also things like the Global Innovation Alliance, right? That connects Singapore to the rest of the world, right? So now there are already 16 countries in that global alliance, and by within the next few years, we hope to ramp that up to about 25. So if you look at these things collectively, then it's really how you build on the fundamentals that Singapore has provided to continue building a global tech hub.
Dixon, let me stay with you. So you obviously rattled off a number of great incentives and reasons why people would want to launch their company here. So from a startup perspective, and let's maybe break out the conversation into like an early stage startup that's just really getting going versus a growth stage one, how could they leverage the different resources and tap into this network and ecosystem that you're talking about?
Sure, thanks, Maria. Yeah, I think so there, like you said, there are two stages of startup, early stage and growth stage, but there are some common themes across them, right? So let me start with talent. When we talk about building talent in Singapore, right? I think we can all recognize that Singapore will not have a fully, or rather, we will not just organically develop all the talent pipeline we need, right? So when we look at talent, we're looking at it in twofold. One is continuing to welcome global talent into Singapore, right? Through your schemes such as, say, your Tech Pass, Entre Pass, Tech at SG. But beyond that, right, when looking at how we develop a pipeline of local talent from the institutes of higher learning, and also through mid-career switches, there are various programs, such as the one Infocom Media Development Authority is running with Workforce Singapore and Skills Future. So under the Tech Skills Accelerator, there are programs that support the training and development of fresh grads and mid-career switches into the to develop ICT skills and allow that transition into the tech industry. So that's one area on talent. The next thing we think about as government when building a tech ecosystem is really building networks and alliances, right? One way that we see is particularly important in the startup world would be connecting corporations with startups, right? And EDB's New Ventures team has actually launched the Corporate Venture Launchpad program, which seeks to work with established corporations in Singapore on essentially developing the next big thing, right, through a corporate venturing approach. So that is just one example, but there are many other ecosystem builders that we continue to push out. And finally, I think if you're a growth stage startup, right, and eventually you're looking at an exit, an IPO, there was recently a range of incentives, right, announced, whether it's the Anchor Fund at 65 or the EDB Investments Growth IPO Fund, that companies could tap on, right, to list, to consider a listing on the SGX at the right stage. So I've covered a few examples today. Of course, there's a broader range of programs and schemes that companies and startups can tap on, and we'd be happy to take on any conversations after the webinar.
Yeah, super informative. So Candice, you are running a very fast growing startup. Would love to hear your experience in terms of how Singapore has been a partner, especially as you started to hit the scale up phase of Shopback's journey.
Sure. Actually, maybe I'll also add on to the previous question as well, because I think long time ago in 2012, I was one of the early hires for Rocket Internet, whereby they decided to set up, I would say, headquarters in Singapore for a collection of their startups. I joined the Zalora venture, but there was also Lazada, Foodpanda, and for those who remember, Easy Taxi, and so on and so forth, right? And I think in terms of enabling early stage and late stage, as you pointed out as well, that might be slightly different. I think to echo Nick's point, in terms of regulatory and political stability, I think that is super important in terms of decisions for HQ. Even currency management, that's also super relevant and important. And in terms of the talent pool and talent scale, I think Singapore being a diverse, racially diverse as well as culturally diverse country has really enabled the ability to let individuals want to live here as well as be able to move here, right? So I think those were some of the considerations, especially for scale-up phase. To be able to attract talent really globally is especially key. But even for the startup phase, in terms of being able to parachute key talent from other HQs is also key. I think Dixon also mentioned in terms of the high concentration of key companies is important, right? In Singapore, you've got a meaningful office for the likes of Google, Facebook, and TikTok. In terms of being able to strike relevant partnerships, that's especially important, especially for scale-up phases, to make sure that we are on the forefront of innovation and being able to provide relevant services for users, for the region as well. So I think it's really a combination of factors, and even some that might be sometimes underestimated. I think in terms of time zone and being able to coordinate well across the globe is also really important. And being able to have a reliable transport system of Changi Airport, fast in and fast out, is also super crucial to get key meetings done. And really the festivals, the conferences that are held in Singapore are also super useful especially for scale-up phases, I would say, to make sure that we are able to engage on key deal makers globally, effectively and really efficiently.
Candice, that was an awesome overview, I think, of all the strengths that Singapore offer as a hub in terms of like really building the ecosystem, being able to quickly and easily access your everywhere from your customers to your talent, and then also having people come in and then deploying people outward, depending on what your business requires. So we have a ton of great questions. I want to make sure we leave enough time to cover a decent amount of them. So let me just ask one more question of my own before we turn it over. I just want to hear what your boldest prediction is for this region over the next 10 years. Nick, I think this is your bread and butter, so I'm going to make you go last, actually.
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. Now you're making me hungry. Bread and butter. Good.
Dixon, we'd love to hear your boldest prediction.
Yeah, I think we covered many points today. We will definitely continue to see digital adoption, right? I remember an old meme I saw at the start of the pandemic, right? What was it that drove your company's digitalization strategy? Was it your CEO? No, it wasn't, right? Was it the CTO? No, it wasn't. It was actually COVID, right? But COVID has really placed us, into a new space, or some would call the metaverse, right? In digital adoption, right? There's no stopping it. The things that we were so used to doing physically, right? Whether it's, say, going to school, buying groceries, seeing the doctor, right? You could do all these digitally today, right? And there's no stopping this trend moving forward. And as people start to realize that, digital solutions do not become an advantage. They become a part of everyday life, right? And when that value is created within society, it's when capital will flow in, right? More people would want to join the industry, right? And where governments would continue to support digital infrastructure and digital economy. And actually, so if you ask me about my boldest prediction in the coming years, I would say I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking about hectocons in the near future.
Bold indeed. Candice?
Well, I do think that this region is really solving difficult and different problems given the heterogeneous nature of the region. And I think that, what's also exciting for Singapore especially is the government really investing into the future in terms of looking at fintech, in terms of looking at blockchain, even looking at food tech, right? And I think some of these innovations will be at the forefront even for global references. So what I really hope for the region is being a point of reference for the 2020s onwards, such that, even now I would say LATAM does refer to Southeast Asia for some best practices. Perhaps in the future or not so distant future, the likes of Europe will also be referring to Singapore or to the region in terms of what the best practices in terms of innovation. So that's my hope.
Should I go next?
Yeah, take us home.
Somebody once said that the hard thing about making predictions is that they're about the future. So I'm going to maybe go out on a limb and try to make a prediction. We see so many wonderful parallels, not perfect parallels, but close enough parallels to how Southeast Asia is developing with Singapore as its hub and other parts of the world. So I'm going to share something which is a little bit hot off the press as we're sort of working on this still and refining it. But if you think about the journey we've been on so far and where we might go next, and you see the obvious parallels to China, we think that there will be $770 billion of incremental public market cap for the tech sector in Southeast Asia over the next 10 years. And you get there by actually a reduction in the intensity of telco market cap relative to GDP, a dramatic increase in hardware market cap relative to GDP, an ongoing increase in internet and consumer services. And when you add it all up, we'll end up with a $1.2 trillion market cap Southeast Asia in 10 years' time. And that may seem like a really big number and maybe even a bit of a provocative statement, but keep in mind that Microsoft alone is 2.5 trillion right now. So what we're saying is that Southeast Asia will have half a Microsoft in 10 years' time. I think that will come to pass.
I actually agree. And I think when you put it in terms of market cap, that number does not look quite as crazy as it might at first glance. Okay, we have a bunch of questions and I want to give airtime. So Candice, there were two for you around the same thing. So the attendees really like the idea of this SWAT team, and I think they want to dig in a little bit more to it. So can you share some more specific methods your SWAT team tried early on to research the consumers in the markets that you were entering in, and then who was actually a part of this team? So functionally, was it sales, marketing, BD, who was part of this group?
Sure. So in the context of ShopBack, the SWAT team will compose of, I would say, individuals involved in marketing, so demand side, as well as individuals linked towards supply side, so BD, business development. Right, as I mentioned, in terms of our customers, we've got consumers, as we've got businesses. So when they're deployed on the ground, it's really a small team, and we're talking about maybe 3 to 4 people. There is a lead that really coordinates and focuses a lot on hiring. So the lead focuses on like looking out for the next leader for that country and really meeting the ecosystems, networking. And then you've got individuals, especially on the marketing side, doing interviews even in Starbucks, getting a sense of what users feel on the ground for different propositions. We literally mean going to a Starbucks and just approaching individuals at certain times. And on the business development side, I think what they would try to do and network would be the business, I would say PICs for possibilities of working with us and understanding really how's their business on the ground. Are we going to be able to add value to them? So it's really a SWAT team of like 3 to 4 people. They are very gritty. They understand that there's an ambiguous problem to solve, and they are very strong navigators of being in a new environment. They are very strong in managing, I would say, cultural differences, and they are individuals that are just very good people. Yeah.
It sounds fun, and I'd like to personally volunteer for your next SWAT team. Also, for the SWAT team, like in terms of timeline, when how would you kind of make the decision to even send the SWAT team in, right? Like you did some desk research and you sent the SWAT team in, and then what was the timeline between when they were deployed to like when you would officially launch ShopBack in that particular country?
Sure. So I would say perhaps the onset, it would be deploying them for like a week or 2 only, just to understand things on the ground, right? And that coupled with desktop research, which is a completely different team, we will make the decision on whether to enter a market or not. Following which, the SWAT team is maybe deployed for 3 to 6 months, really, on the ground, and really just working the local market, understanding and hiring, very importantly, hiring. Because in terms of the SWAT team, we don't envision them to be running the team for a long period. In fact, we'll need to deploy them to a new country. So the timelines wise would be, as I say, upon decision, we'll deploy them for like 3 to 6 months. After key hires are made, they'll come back to HQ, and perhaps another 6 months later, they'll go back again, just to make sure everything is in sync.
All right, quite a structured process. Dixon and Nick, there are a few questions here about whether or not startups need to have an actual presence in presence in Singapore. So Singapore is obviously the capital of Southeast Asia, as you mentioned, Nick. Does that mean that if you're looking to expand, but you're not based in Singapore, will you have more challenges than if you actually had a physical presence here? And then the same question is, would you have more difficulty accessing VC funding if you do not have presence here?
It's a terrific question. I'm very grateful for the individual who asked it. Historically, I would have said that, there was a tremendous advantage to being in Singapore, and that's still very much the case. What we're seeing, though, is a new strategy as well, where your company is headquartered in Singapore, but you might also have an HQ too, so to speak, in the region, maybe in your largest market. A perfect example of that is Carson, one of our favorite portfolio companies, and they were founded in KL, but their chief financial officer, their chief operating officer sits right here in Singapore. And if you think about sort of the funding opportunity vis-a-vis Singapore versus other countries, I wanted to share something very interesting with the group, and this is very timely. It's really just happening in these last 3 or 4 months. Historically, if you looked at sort of where the funding was going, it would typically go about half to Singapore-based startups, and about a quarter to Indonesia-based startups, and a little sliver of kind of Malaysia kind of coming in some ways as part of that Singapore sort of cluster. Something very interesting has happened of late. And I just want to contextualize this. If you think about funding in Southeast Asia, let's add a baseline, a reference point, which is how funding in China works. When you're in that kind of middle zone, raising a Series C or raising a Series D, if you're in China, the country invests about 0.097%, about basically 10 basis points of GDP into those rounds every year. And the reason we've talked for a long time about there being a funding gap in Southeast Asia is that actually Southeast Asia has been about 4 basis points of delta. That may seem like a very small thing, but you multiply it across trillions of dollars of GDP, and it's about $1 billion missing per year. But to the question about where is it easier to raise money right now, interestingly, Indonesia is on fire right now. It's a very near-term dynamic, and much of that is coming through Singapore from a structuring and a financing perspective. It used to be easier to raise capital in Singapore than it used to be in Indonesia. And in just the last few weeks and months, Indonesia has poked up ahead. But before you draw the erroneous conclusion that you'd rather be focusing on Indonesia than Singapore, consider this. Do you really want to be raising capital when everybody else in your competition is raising capital too? Or would you be rather of just a handful of high quality teams that's raised just the right amount of capital to go after your opportunity set? That's actually, in our mind, going to be one of the greatest advantages of Singapore, that it's a very balanced and sober and thoughtful environment, whereas there are parts of Southeast Asia right now, candidly, that we think are a little overheated. That'll be a near-term dynamic. And I'll leave the group with one final thought. Funding comes, funding goes. There are good times, there are bad times. We personally think that there will eventually be a giant crash in the tech markets, but the vast majority of large global companies, Fortune 500 companies, were founded during times of adversity. So never forget that fact. It seems like happy times are here again, but I think the very best companies will be formed out of the crucible of what might come next, and that'll be a tremendous advantage to Singapore.
Yeah, perhaps just to add on, I think Nick covered it very well, right? I don't think everyone necessarily has to be in Singapore, right, to tap on the region. But Singapore offers, I guess if you could think about it as a control hub, right, for the region. And for companies with a regional strategy, it goes beyond, like Nick said, it goes beyond funding, right, to very soft factors that are hard to describe on paper. Whether it's in the ecosystem, right, being able to talk to upstream, downstream partners, right, or even talking to the local research ecosystem, whether it's your research institutes or universities or other institutes of higher learning. These are soft factors, right, that are very hard to quantify. But companies in Singapore have found that when they tap on this ecosystem, they have shown or proven to themselves and their books that this is something of value to them, which is why then they continue to grow their teams and continue to hire out of Singapore, right? And beyond just, I guess, status quo, when you think about startups growing, right, and your regional mandate growing as well, and you think about hubs in the region, I think Singapore stands out as a key attractive hub for those kinds of operations, which then makes it collectively a pretty good value proposition and a desirable place to sort of locate your headquarters.
All right, we have given obviously a lot of airtime to both Singapore and Indonesia, but obviously there are other very many interesting countries within this region. There's a question around Vietnam more specifically. So Vietnam has been a country that has been difficult for foreign investors to enter. And so the question is, who are some of the best potential partners that one would recommend in order for global VCs or corporate VCs to build relationships in Vietnam? Let me also add on to this. Obviously, Vietnam's not just, it's investors, but then also on the startup side. So we'd be curious to hear the panel's perspective as to how one can enter the Vietnamese market.
It's a great question, Maria, and you know the market very well from your earlier work in, of course, tech in Asia. Let me hopefully not hurt anyone's feelings by saying this. Unlike certain parts of the world, let's use India as an example, where the Tatas have been reliable partners for 100 years for people to launch their businesses there, or others in different jurisdictions. Vietnam is a young and growing economy. There's a handful of families that have partnered very well with global private equity firms, with entrepreneurs, but it's still a relatively fragmented place. So it would be hard to pick one particular set of individuals. But I just want to really emphasize and really call out two things that are so exciting about Vietnam. And again, Singapore stands to benefit from having even more prosperity in its broader region. Point number one, Vietnam, more so than any other country in Southeast Asia, is sending its young children abroad for college. And it may be the case that they get a good education, maybe even a better one than domestically, although I dispute that. Vietnamese institutions of higher learning are great. But the important thing is they come back with a group of friends that are from the region. They join the Asian Students Association at the University of California, and they come back with a Thai and a Vietnamese and an Indonesian buddy, and that could be the next grab. So watch this space, Vietnamese founders coming back home. And the second thing, Vietnamese game companies. Vietnam is turning into a new Helsinki or a new Seoul in terms of its game industry. The number of companies with over 20 million of EBITDA that no one had even heard of in Vietnam just 24 months ago is outstanding. Keep an eye on that space as well. And I think that's to Singapore's benefit to have this ecosystem of digital IP and digital content broaden. Vietnam's got to solve one fundamental problem. It's so darn hard for a Vietnamese company to go public in Singapore or go public in America. And it's not because of the Singapore rules or because of the American rules. They have to unburden that for their own entrepreneurs and maybe get to a model where their entrepreneurs are liberated to go public anywhere in the world and then bring that capital back home.
Absolutely. Candice, any specific stories from expanding into Vietnam that you thought would be useful for this particular conversation?
I think for Vietnam, actually, it's interestingly, we set up a tech hub first and then set up our commercial business. So really what drew us to Vietnam was the availability of tech talent and at scale as well. And we also saw that a lot of other companies or regional companies are setting tech hubs in Vietnam. So I think the talent pool was a really strong draw for us. Subsequently, as we evaluated the market, we decided to set up the commercial arm. So I think what's interesting for Vietnam is that I think the talent really is deep there. And I think in terms of commercial viability, that's going to really grow with time as well. So I'm also optimistic about Vietnam, and I definitely see that many players are doing really well there. Many players which are regional for that matter.
All right. We have a question about country risk. So of course, like the size of the potential in each country before you expand into it has to be evaluated against the risk of penetrating and dominating that particular market. So any specific metrics that you all use or that you're tracking when you're evaluating country risk and whether or not this is like a fit market to expand into?
Maybe I'll take a step at that. So perhaps the way we look at it is more market potential rather than market risk. Right. If we're looking at market risk, the way we look at it is how or why is it different in terms of some of the assumptions we might have for the other markets. This again could be on the supply side or this could be on the demand side. I think that's the way we potentially look at risk. Of course, we will consider areas like governmental stability or currency risk as well. But I think this time and age, or at least in APAC, for most markets, that's usually not our biggest concern. I think where we are thinking about is in terms of winning in the market, in terms of being able to have adequate demand in the market. That would be the areas that we focus a little bit more on. Yeah.
Maria, I think it's such a great question that you pose, and I agree with what Candice has shared. Let me just go back and circle back maybe in the minute we have left to this concept of why Singapore is such a fair place to do business. And what that manifests into when that may not be the case in terms of the atmospherics. Somebody very wise, much wiser by a millionfold than I am, told me once, the danger of certain parts of Asia is that if you lose money on your investment, you're out of luck. And if you make money on your investment, you're out of luck. Because if you lose money, no one will rescue you. And if you make money, the knives come out to make sure that money never comes home to you, but is kept locally in some way or the other. It's only if you have a 14% middling IRR that perhaps you're just not consequential enough for people to bother with you. Singapore has never subscribed to that philosophy. If you make money here, it's yours. If you lose money, well, tough luck, try again next time. And that fairness to the upside is what defines great tech ecosystems. Nothing is stopping Microsoft from becoming a $2.5 trillion company, Apple a $2 trillion company, because at some level they've earned it. And I think that's a tremendous advantage for great markets like Singapore that are built upon the traditional British common law system of take the risk, but then enjoy the reward.
All right, Nick, that is the best way for us to end off our panel. So thanks everyone for your time today. Thanks to all the panelists for all the amazing insights. And I think the really great sharing and honestly, the reflection as to what it's like operating a startup within this region. So for folks at home, if you're interested in learning more about the investment landscape in Southeast Asia, there is an upcoming investment roundtable that's being hosted by EDB called A Sea of Opportunity. It's going to be a series of roundtables discussing Southeast Asia's tech investment. We hope to see you there. So thanks everyone for joining, and to my panelists and all attendees, be safe and be well.